January 4th, AD 1642. King Charles I enters the House of Commons with armed men at his back. He has come to arrest 5 members accused of treason: John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Hollis, William Strode, and Sir Arthur Hazelrig. In a single extraordinary act, royal force has crossed the threshold of the chamber whose consent gives the crown access to the wealth of the kingdom. But the 5 members are gone. Warned before the king arrived, they have escaped into the protection of London. Charles looks toward the empty places where they should have been and reportedly concedes, "I see all the birds are flown. The arrest has failed. The damage has not." Charles entered the Commons believing that he was striking against treason. Instead, he handed his enemies the most powerful image of arbitrary government they could have demanded. A king invading the representative chamber with armed force, searching for political opponents who had challenged his authority. 5 men escaped capture, but something far greater began slipping from the king's grasp. The confidence of the capital, the credibility of his promises, and the presumption that royal power remained the safest guardian of England's laws. 7 years later, on January 30th, AD 1649, that same king walks onto a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. A specially created court has condemned him as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy. Charles refuses to recognize its authority. In his eyes, no assembly of subjects can lawfully judge the sovereign from whom earthly justice flows. The executioner raises the axe. The blade descends. For the first time in English history, a reigning monarch has been publicly tried and executed by a government acting in the name of the people. An institution protected by inheritance, law, religion, custom, and sacred anointing is broken before a stunned kingdom. Yet the most astonishing fact is not simply that Parliament defeated a king. Parliament did not retain control of the revolution it had helped unleash. Between those 2 January mornings, authority passed through 3 rival institutions. It began with the Crown, embodied by a hereditary sovereign who believed government could not survive if Parliament dictated to its king. It moved toward Parliament, whose leaders argued that taxation, liberty, religion, and law could not survive if the king governed beyond representative consent. Then it passed toward the new model army, created by Parliament as its military servant, hardened by war, and eventually prepared to purge the Parliament it had been raised to defend. The servant became the judge of its master. This is Professor Adrian Lockwell, approaching the English civil wars from the war room, the Senate floor, and the grand chessboard of institutional power. The central mystery is larger than the question of why Englishmen fought Englishmen. Kingdoms had survived rebellions before. It is larger even than the question of why Charles lost. Kings had lost wars without losing their heads. The deeper mystery is how institutions claiming to preserve England's constitution gradually found reasons to violate it, and how an army created to rescue parliamentary government acquired the power to decide which parliament could govern. The conflict did not begin as a modern contest between democracy and dictatorship. That interpretation belongs more to later political mythology than to the England of the 1640s. Most parliamentarians were not Republicans when the crisis began. Many considered monarchy essential to order, nor were all royalists defenders of unlimited royal power. Many believed the king was bound by law, yet feared that a parliament claiming indefinite authority could become as dangerous as the royal prerogative it opposed. Both sides invoked England's ancient constitution. Both claimed to defend Protestantism, property, liberty, and law. Both accused the other of introducing dangerous innovations while pretending to restore an older balance. Royalists charged Parliament's leaders with dismantling the mixed government of king, lords, and commons. Parliamentarians charged Charles and his ministers with preserving its outward forms while draining them of meaning, until law became whatever royal necessity required. The vocabulary was shared. The meanings were irreconcilable. Compromise depends upon more than temporary agreement. It requires confidence that an opponent will still respect limits after gaining an advantage. By AD 1642, that confidence was vanishing. Control of the militia was no longer treated as an ordinary political dispute. Whoever commanded armed force might determine whether king or parliament could survive. Religious ceremony was no longer merely a matter of worship. To many Protestants, it signaled an advance toward Catholicism and arbitrary rule. Parliamentary influence over royal ministers was not merely an administrative reform. To Charles, it threatened to reduce kingship to a ceremonial hostage. Every disputed power had become a weapon that neither side believed could safely be entrusted to the other. The crown possessed the oldest and most emotionally commanding claim. Charles had been anointed. He was not merely a magistrate carrying an impressive title. Kingship, in his understanding, belonged to the divinely ordered structure of society. Subjects could petition, advise, and seek redress, but they could not become judges over their sovereign. If that principle collapsed, Charles believed obedience itself would dissolve into faction. Parliament drew authority from a different foundation. The Commons represented counties and boroughs. Statutes required royal assent, but extraordinary taxation depended upon parliamentary grant. The king possessed a crown. He did not possess England as a private estate. Parliamentary leaders therefore argued that the kingdom's laws, liberties, and property existed within a constitutional trust that the monarch had sworn to preserve. Resistance to a king who violated that trust could be presented not as revolution, but as restoration. The army's claim emerged later, forged in battlefield sacrifice, unpaid wages, religious conviction, and repeated political disappointment. The new model army inherited no throne and possessed no ordinary electoral mandate. Its authority came from organization, victory, and the dangerous conviction that those who had shed blood for England had earned a voice in shaping its peace. This was coercive power, but many officers and soldiers did not experience it as naked ambition. They believed they had watched civilian politicians bargain away the cause for which their comrades had died. They began to suspect that constitutional procedures could become shelters for betrayal. If a defeated king secretly prepared another war, and if members of parliament still sought agreement with him, military intervention could be imagined as national salvation rather than usurpation. Each faction came to believe that obedience to the others would destroy England. That belief created a political security dilemma. Measures intended as defense appeared as preparations for attack. When Charles sought forces loyal to the crown, Parliament saw the machinery of tyranny. When Parliament claimed control of the militia, Royalists saw the dismemberment of monarchy. When the army later demanded guarantees for its soldiers and its cause, civilian politicians saw an armed corporation placing itself above the state. Each escalation became evidence that the opposing faction had been dangerous all along. Trust was not destroyed in one moment. It was exhausted through contested taxes, disputed imprisonments, religious reforms, procedural manipulation, rumors of Catholic conspiracy, inflammatory declarations, and promises made while alternative plans remained concealed. The machinery of government continued to move even as faith in those operating it disintegrated. Laws were debated, petitions circulated, courts delivered judgments, declarations poured from printing presses. Beneath that language of legality, rival institutions were learning to answer argument with command. The attempted arrest of the 5 members revealed the transformation with brutal clarity. Charles failed to seize Pym, Hampden, Hollis, Strode, and Hazelrig, but the strategic loss extended far beyond 5 empty seats. London rallied around the accused members. The king withdrew from the capital. Parliament tightened its connection to the kingdom's largest concentration of money, population, printing, and political mobilization. Yet Parliament's ascendancy did not resolve the location of sovereignty. It multiplied the claimants. If Parliament could resist the king in the name of the nation, the question remained who could resist Parliament when Parliament itself fractured. If military victory revealed divine favor, no settled principle determined how the victorious should be restrained. The old constitution had relied upon institutions sharing power. Civil war would tempt each institution to claim that survival required supremacy. The road from the commons to the scaffold was neither a straight march toward liberty nor an inevitable descent into military rule. It was opened by decisions made under pressure, by factions increasingly convinced that the ordinary restraints of politics had become suicidal. Long before the axe fell at Whitehall, royal government had begun losing the confidence upon which obedience depended. Charles still possessed majesty, prerogative, and immense inherited authority. What he lacked was the financial machinery to sustain extraordinary war without political consent. That weakness drove the crown toward ingenious expedients and turned apparently technical disputes over taxation into tests of sovereignty. The struggle that would eventually destroy a king began, in part, with a monarchy powerful enough to demand obedience, but not powerful enough to finance its ambitions alone. Beneath the authority of Charles I lay a structural weakness no ceremony could conceal. He wore 3 crowns, ruling England, Scotland, and Ireland, but these realms did not form a single integrated state. They constituted a composite monarchy, united by one sovereign, yet divided by law, religion, political institutions, and historical memory. A command issued at Whitehall could appear lawful in London, intrusive in Edinburgh, and dangerous in Dublin. Charles possessed formidable prerogative, but not a modern administrative machine capable of transforming royal will into unlimited revenue. England had no permanent income tax, no national bureaucracy reaching uniformly into every locality, and no financial system that allowed the crown to sustain major warfare without cooperation from the political nation. Customary revenues could support ordinary government. Extraordinary danger demanded extraordinary taxation, and extraordinary taxation traditionally required Parliament. The constitutional boundary remained dangerously imprecise. Parliament did not claim to replace the king, and Charles did not deny Parliament a legitimate role. The explosive question was who possessed the authority to define an emergency. If necessity justified exceptional power, who decided when necessity existed, how far that power extended, and when it must end? Military intervention in continental Europe brought this ambiguity into the open. Campaigns produced expense, disappointment, and recrimination. Charles needed additional money, while members of parliament demanded remedies against practices they believed had broken the ancient restraints surrounding royal government. In AD 1628, Parliament presented the Petition of Right. The petition challenged taxation and forced loans imposed without parliamentary grant. It condemned imprisonment without cause shown, the billeting of soldiers in private homes, and the use of martial law against civilians in peacetime. These were not remote constitutional theories. Forced loans threatened property. Billeting placed armed servants of the crown inside local communities. Unexplained imprisonment suggested that resistance could be punished without ordinary legal protection. Martial law raised an even darker possibility, that military necessity could consume civilian justice. Parliament was constructing a defensive perimeter around the subject's body, household, and purse. Charles accepted the Petition of Right, but the apparent settlement concealed incompatible interpretations. The king believed that his prerogative remained indispensable to effective government. His critics feared that concessions made under pressure would later be narrowed or circumvented. Both sides invoked law, but law was becoming less a common language than a system of rival fortifications. In AD 1629, Charles dissolved Parliament. For the next 11 years, until AD 1640, he governed England without summoning another. His enemies later called this the 11 Years' Tyranny. Yet that label can exaggerate the crown's strength. Charles was not an omnipotent absolutist standing above English society. He was a financially constrained monarch attempting to preserve political independence with inadequate instruments. At first, the personal rule appeared workable. Peace reduced military expenditure. Customs and traditional revenues were administered more aggressively. The crown revived neglected rights and exploited procedures that often possessed some legal precedent. But every recovered fee imposed a political cost. Monopolies granted exclusive privileges over trades and commodities, enriching patentees while encouraging the belief that public authority had been converted into private profit. Distraint of knighthood fined eligible landowners who had failed to present themselves for knighthood at the coronation, resurrecting a feudal obligation that appeared increasingly artificial. Forest fines relied upon ancient royal boundaries, sometimes extending over land long treated as secure private property. To the crown, these were legitimate revenues left uncollected. To many subjects, they were dormant powers being excavated because the king wished to avoid parliament. The most consequential instrument was ship money. Ship money had historical precedence. Coastal communities could be ordered to supply ships, or their financial equivalent, for maritime defense, especially during periods of danger. Charles expanded this limited obligation. In AD 1634, writs went to coastal areas. In AD 1635, the demand reached inland counties. The levy then became annual, all without parliamentary authorization. Ship money was a sovereignty test disguised as a revenue measure. The individual assessment might be small, but the constitutional implication was immense. If the king alone could proclaim a national danger, determine the necessary response, and impose taxation to meet it, an emergency power could become a permanent revenue system. Necessity would no longer interrupt the constitutional rule for a temporary crisis. It would redefine the rule itself. Charles's defense was serious. Piracy, maritime rivalry, and European warfare were genuine threats. A sovereign charged with defending the kingdom could argue that the opposing argument was equally serious. If necessity could be defined exclusively by the crown, necessity had no enforceable boundary. Every royal priority could be described as security, and every levy as an instrument of survival. Parliamentary consent would cease to be a constitutional requirement and become a royal convenience. John Hampden transformed that dispute into a national trial. Hampden, a Buckinghamshire gentleman with strong parliamentary connections, refused to pay an assessment of 20 shillings. The amount was deliberately modest. His resistance was not driven by financial ruin but by the principle concealed inside the demand. Rex versus Hampden came before the judges in AD 1637. 7 ruled for the crown and 5 against. Hampden therefore lost the case, but Charles failed to secure the political victory he required. The divided judgment revealed that the legal foundation of ship money remained uncertain even within the judicial establishment. Reports of the arguments circulated through manuscripts, correspondence, and elite political networks. 5 judges had rejected the royal claim. Far from demonstrating that resistance was futile, the case showed that learned authorities could regard the levy as unconstitutional. Charles had won permission to continue collection while exposing how contested that permission had become. A government can win a judgment and still lose confidence. Rex versus Hampden validated the levy in court, yet it also allowed opponents to portray the crown as stretching narrow precedents into a general power of taxation. Collection continued, but compliance deteriorated. More damagingly, Ship money trained influential landowners to read each fiscal demand as evidence of the regime Charles intended to build. A levy was no longer merely a levy. It became a warning about what royal government might become if no institution could compel negotiation. Charles's fundamental problem was not simple poverty. During peace, he could collect ordinary revenues, enforce prerogative rights, and maintain the machinery of government. What he could not reliably finance was extraordinary warfare over a sustained period. War consumed armies, weapons, transport, fortifications, provisions, and credit at a speed that customary revenues and legal ingenuity could not match. Parliamentary taxation supplied more than money. It provided representative endorsement, encouraged cooperation from county elites, and reassured lenders that future revenues would exist to service debts. Consent strengthened credit because it widened the coalition responsible for repayment. Without that confidence, the crown could demand, fine, and improvise, but it struggled to borrow and mobilize on the scale required by prolonged war. This was the strategic trap inside the personal rule. Excluding Parliament protected Charles from parliamentary conditions, but it also denied him the fiscal credibility Parliament could confer. Royal independence remained sustainable only while peace kept expenditure within manageable limits. A major military emergency would force the crown to choose between retreat and a return to the representative institution it had spent 11 years avoiding. Legality and legitimacy were consequently drifting apart. Many revenue devices could be defended through precedent, judicial opinion, and inherited royal rights. Yet constitutional government depends on more than a favorable ruling. It requires a broad conviction that authority remains inside recognizable boundaries. By reviving archaic claims and expanding emergency measures, the crown convinced growing numbers among the political nation that constitutional rules were being manipulated rather than preserved. Money alone did not make civil war inevitable. Taxes could be renegotiated, and fiscal settlements could be reconstructed. But Charles was applying the same centralizing instincts to a realm far more combustible than revenue: worship, church government, and salvation. Financial improvisation had eroded trust. Religion would transform that distrust into existential fear. When the Long Parliament assembled in November, AD 1640, grievance acquired machinery. Speeches became committees, suspicions became impeachments, and constitutional memory hardened into statute. At the center stood John Pym, not as a modern party leader commanding disciplined votes, but as a coalition builder holding together Puritan reformers, defenders of parliamentary privilege, anxious landowners, and constitutional conservatives who opposed the personal rule yet feared an unrestrained parliament almost as much as an unrestrained crown. Its first great target was Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, Charles's formidable minister and former Lord Deputy of Ireland. To his enemies, Strafford embodied the use of concentrated royal authority to make government more efficient, more obedient, and less dependent upon consent. Yet his impeachment for treason encountered a legal obstacle. Political menace was not automatically treason, and Parliament could not confidently prove that Strafford had committed the offense as existing law defined it. The prosecution therefore shifted to a bill of attainder, a legislative act declaring him guilty and prescribing punishment without an ordinary judicial conviction. The maneuver exposed the parliamentary cause to its own accusation. Men condemning arbitrary government were using extraordinary power to eliminate an enemy whom they might fail to convict through established procedure. Charles had promised Strafford protection, but under immense political pressure and fear of unrest, he granted royal assent. Strafford was executed in May, AD 1641. The sacrifice purchased no durable trust. Charles demonstrated that royal promises could collapse under pressure, while Parliament discovered that statutory force, reinforced by public mobilization, could overcome the king's resistance. A minister had fallen, but the deeper casualty was confidence in restraint. Star Chamber and High Commission, institutions associated with political punishment and religious coercion, were abolished. The Triennial Act sought to prevent another 11-year disappearance of Parliament, and further measures dismantled the fiscal and judicial architecture of the personal rule. But constitutional repair was already expanding into a struggle over who would choose the king's ministers, determine the church settlement, and command the armed power of the state. The Irish Rebellion of October, AD 1641, turned that struggle into an emergency. Catholic insurgency, Protestant killings, dispossession, and retaliatory violence generated a torrent of atrocity reports. Some preserved evidence of genuine horrors. Others inflated numbers, merged rumor with testimony, or converted local violence into proof of a coordinated international plot. In England's intensely anti-Catholic political culture, fear traveled faster than verification. An army was required to suppress the rebellion. Yet whoever commanded that army might command England. Parliamentary leaders feared that Charles could raise troops for Ireland and then employ them against domestic opponents. Royalists feared that Pym and his allies intended to seize the militia and reduce monarchy to ceremonial dependence. The military solution to one rebellion therefore threatened to create another. Measures presented by each side as self-defense appeared to the other as preparations for domination. Pym answered with the Grand Remonstrance in November, AD 1641, an immense indictment of misgovernment, religious innovation, and alleged conspiracy, joined to demands for further reform. Passed the Commons by only 11 votes. That narrow margin revealed a parliament dividing against itself. Members who had helped dismantle the personal rule now suspected that reformers were moving from government with the king toward government over him. The future royalist coalition was forming inside the original opposition. Charles then committed the intervention that shattered much of London's remaining confidence. On January 4, AD 1642, he entered the House of Commons with armed attendants to arrest John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Hollis, William Strode, and Sir Arthur Hazelrig. The 5 members had already escaped. Confronted by their empty places and the chamber's refusal to assist him, the king withdrew. The failed arrest transformed suspicion into public alarm. It violated parliamentary privilege, appeared to confirm warnings about royal coercion, and surrendered the political initiative in the capital. London's crowds rallied around Parliament, and Charles soon abandoned the city. The king had entered the Commons seeking 5 opponents and emerged having strengthened thousands. Legality now fractured into rival commands. Parliament issued the Militia Ordinance without royal assent. Charles answered with commissions of array grounded in older claims of royal authority. The 19 Propositions of June, AD 1642, demanded parliamentary influence over ministers, the royal children's education and marriages, the church settlement and control of armed force. The dispute had moved far beyond unlawful taxation. It now concerned whether Charles could still govern as king and whether Parliament could defend the Constitution without acquiring sovereign power itself. In August, Charles raised his standard at Nottingham. 2 competing systems began to mobilize, although allegiance followed no simple class or regional map. County rivalries, family obligations, religious convictions, local memories, and competing definitions of order divided communities. Aristocrats and merchants appeared on both sides. Some families split across the conflict, demonstrating that civil war does not merely separate territories. It forces rival meanings of loyalty into the same households. Parliament controlled the kingdom's strategic heart: London, much of the southeast, major customs revenues, dense populations, financial institutions, and printing capacity. Most critically, the Royal Navy aligned with Parliament, restricting Charles's access to ports, weapons, and foreign assistance while protecting parliamentary commerce. The Royalists drew strength from much of the west and north, experienced commanders, and the ancient symbolic authority of the crown. Oxford became Charles's wartime capital, supporting a court, councils, presses, and military administration. Prince Rupert of the Rhine brought aggression and cavalry expertise, but symbolic authority and battlefield brilliance could not replace a durable system of extraction. Armies consumed money relentlessly. Muskets required powder, horses required fodder, garrisons required food, and soldiers expected wages even when governments offered promises. Both camps established magazines, imposed local assessments, seized hostile estates through sequestration, and organized county associations. Parliament increasingly relied upon excise taxation on domestic consumption. These mechanisms were intrusive and unpopular, but they sustained organized violence. Armies fight battles. Taxation systems determine how many battles they can survive. At Edgehill in October, AD 1642, the principal armies collided without achieving a decisive result. Rupert's cavalry broke opposing horse with a powerful charge, but pursuit carried mounted troops away from the central infantry struggle. This was not proof that all royalist cavalry lacked discipline. It revealed a recurring operational danger. Cavalry could win its own contest and still fail to influence the decisive moment. Charles advanced toward London, but at Turnham Green he confronted the mobilized weight of the capital. Parliamentary troops, London-trained bands, and armed citizens assembled in numbers too formidable to attack without enormous risk. The Royalists withdrew. The battle that never occurred proved more consequential than many that did. Charles had approached Parliament's political, financial, and administrative center, but he could not seize it. The Royalist high tide followed in AD 1643. Victories in the west and the capture of Bristol gave Charles a major port and exposed Parliament's military weakness. Yet London remained beyond his grasp. Parliament could lose an army and raise another because the capital allowed it to borrow, tax, print, recruit, and coordinate. Royalist battlefield success could wound the parliamentary system, but without London it could not destroy that system. Stalemate pushed the war beyond England. Under the Solemn League and Covenant of AD 1643, the Scottish Covenanters promised military assistance while Parliament committed itself to religious reformation according to the Word of God and the example of the best Reformed churches. The alliance offered soldiers, but it carried a confessional price. English Presbyterians welcomed a national church governed through assemblies. Independents and other Protestants resisted replacing episcopal compulsion with Presbyterian compulsion. Scotland could help defeat Charles while intensifying the struggle over what victory would mean. Charles pursued external resources of his own. In Ireland, Royalist representatives negotiated a cessation with the Confederate Catholics in AD 1643. The suspension of hostilities allowed some troops serving the royal government to cross into England. Strategically, it released manpower. Politically, it was poisonous. Parliament portrayed the agreement as evidence that the king would employ forces associated with Catholic Ireland against Protestant England. The distinction between returning Protestant soldiers and the specter of a Catholic invasion was overwhelmed by confessional fear. Both camps also sought money, arms, recognition, or leverage from France, the Dutch Republic, Scotland, and Ireland. Information, therefore, became an extension of war. Newsbooks, declarations, sermons, petitions, and atrocity narratives did not merely report events. They assigned meaning to them. Defeat became divine chastisement. Victory became providential judgment. Taxation was presented as sacrifice, obedience as conscience, and enemy success as the destruction of religion and law. Beneath, the mathematician John Wallis became especially valuable to Parliament by deciphering royalist communications. Ciphers promised secrecy, but repeated symbols, linguistic patterns, captured keys, and human carelessness created openings. Code-breaking converted private calculations into strategic knowledge. Intelligence became politically decisive only when secret discovery could be transformed into credible public evidence. Parliament lost its greatest coalition manager when John Pym died in December AD 1643. The coalition survived, but without the architect who had repeatedly joined constitutional grievance, religious fear, London finance, and Scottish diplomacy into a common strategy. Royal secrecy would later furnish Parliament with its most devastating evidence. Correspondence captured after Naseby and published as the King's Cabinet opened exposed Charles's continuing appeals for Irish and foreign assistance. Private diplomacy became a public indictment of his negotiating candor. Before that reckoning, however, the Scottish alliance had to alter the northern balance, and Parliament had to build an army capable of converting superior resources into decisive victory. The Scottish alliance changed the balance of manpower, but it could not cure Parliament's divided command. That weakness became unmistakable during the York campaign of AD 1644. Parliamentarian and Covenanter armies converged on the city, threatening the Marquis of Newcastle's principal royalist stronghold in northern England. Charles I ordered Prince Rupert to relieve it. Moving with characteristic speed, Rupert gathered forces across Lancashire, crossed the Pennines, and compelled the besiegers to withdraw. Relieving York, however, was not the same as destroying the Allied armies. On July 2nd, west of the city, Rupert and Newcastle confronted a larger coalition at Marston Moor. The Allied host combined the Scottish Covenanters, Lord Fairfax's northern forces, and the Earl of Manchester's eastern association. These armies shared an enemy, but not a single command structure or an agreed vision of the political order that victory should create. The battle began late in the day and quickly fractured into separate struggles. On the Allied left, Oliver Cromwell's cavalry absorbed the Royalist attack, recovered its cohesion, and returned to the fight. His performance was formidable, but the later legend of a solitary Cromwellian triumph obscures the coalition that made victory possible. David Leslie's Scottish cavalry reinforced and redirected the mounted assault. Scottish infantry endured severe pressure in the center, while Manchester's troops and the forces of the Fairfaxes helped close the battlefield around the Royalists. By nightfall, Rupert's army had been broken. Newcastle's celebrated infantry, including the Whitecoats, was virtually annihilated. York surrendered soon afterward, and Royalist control across much of northern England collapsed. The Crown lost territory, recruits, revenues, and strategic depth. Yet Marston Moor also exposed the limitations of Parliament's own war system. Its armies remained attached to regional associations, local treasuries, political patrons, and commanders whose objectives did not always coincide. The conflict between Cromwell and the Earl of Manchester brought that contradiction into Parliament itself. Cromwell accused Manchester of conducting the war without the determination necessary to finish it. Manchester, a peer with conservative instincts, feared the consequences of complete royalist defeat. If the king were crushed, who would restrain the forces that had crushed him? Cromwell regarded hesitation as strategic paralysis. Manchester regarded Cromwell's urgency as the beginning of constitutional and social upheaval. Both fears contained a dangerous truth. An army denied decisive action could prolong national ruin. An army powerful enough to impose a decisive settlement might cease to behave as Parliament's servant. The political response was the self-denying ordinance, intended to separate many members of Parliament from military command and weaken the aristocratic rivalries fragmenting the war effort. Resistance in the House of Lords forced revisions, but the measure removed several senior commanders. It was accompanied by the new model ordinance, which created a national field army in AD 1645 under Sir Thomas Fairfax. Fairfax was not a ceremonial compromise. He was an experienced commander capable of holding together officers divided by religion, ambition, and political temperament. Philip Skippon commanded the infantry. Cromwell, despite the logic of self-denial, received successive exemptions and remained as Lieutenant General of Horse. Parliament had removed politicians from command in the name of efficiency, then preserved the commander whose political authority would grow most dramatically under the new system. The Eastern Association had already demonstrated the power of pooling men, money, and supplies across county boundaries. The new model army transformed that regional experiment into a national instrument. Its regiments followed a more standardized structure. Its command was centralized. Its soldiers were intended to receive regular pay, and the army could serve wherever national strategy required rather than where county committees preferred. It was neither a modern meritocracy nor a uniformly radical force. Social rank and patronage remained influential. Pay repeatedly fell into arrears. Discipline could be severe, recruitment remained uneven, and religious beliefs ranged from Presbyterian orthodoxy to independent congregationalism and more radical sectarian currents. Many soldiers cared less about constitutional theory than wages, food, legal protection, and survival. Yet the Army's intense Protestant culture encouraged officers and soldiers to interpret victory as evidence of providential favor. Success could therefore appear not merely useful, but morally revealing. Parliament had redesigned its weapon. It had made that weapon more mobile, more coherent, and increasingly conscious of its own worth. The military problem was being solved while the constitutional problem quietly acquired regiments. The new army faced its decisive test in June AD 1645. After Royalist forces stormed Leicester, alarm in Westminster drew Fairfax away from operations against Oxford. Near Naseby, Charles I and Prince Rupert chose battle against Parliament's principal field army. Fairfax held overall command, with Cromwell leading cavalry on the right and Henry Ireton commanding horse on the left. Rupert directed the Royalist right, while Sir Marmaduke Langdale's northern cavalry occupied the left. Rupert's opening attack succeeded. Ireton's wing was disordered, and Royalist cavalry pursued toward Parliament's baggage. This did not prove that Royalist horsemen were universally undisciplined. Pursuit was a recurring feature of 17th-century cavalry warfare, and Rupert's aggression had produced victories before. At Naseby, however, it removed crucial strength while the central battle remained undecided. On Parliament's right, Cromwell defeated Langdale's outnumbered cavalry while retaining control over substantial elements of his force. Some horsemen pursued, but others turned inward against the Royalist infantry. Fairfax and Skippon kept the parliamentarian center intact through severe fighting, and reserves contained the Royalist advance. Cromwell's returning cavalry then struck the king's infantry from flank and rear. The interaction of cohesion, reserves, command, and institutional reform decided what courage alone could not. The Royalist center collapsed. Parliament captured guns, standards, baggage, officers, thousands of soldiers, and something potentially more destructive than artillery: the king's private correspondence. Charles escaped, but his letters were published under the title "The King's Cabinet Opened." Parliament selected and framed the documents for maximum political effect, yet their authenticity gave the campaign unusual force. They revealed Charles's continuing attempts to secure assistance from Ireland and abroad while negotiations remained publicly possible. Naseby destroyed more than the king's principal field army. It destroyed another portion of confidence in his negotiating candor. Royalist resistance continued, but strategic recovery became extraordinarily difficult. Bristol fell to Fairfax in September, and remaining strongholds were reduced one after another. In May AD 1646, Charles placed himself in Scottish hands at Southwell. He expected the divisions among Scottish Covenanters, English Presbyterians, Independents, Parliament, and the army to restore the leverage that battle had taken from him. After a financial and political settlement between the Scottish and English governments, Charles entered Parliament's custody in AD 1647. Regiments elected agitators, also called agents, to present their grievances. Through the army's solemn engagement, demands for pay and indemnity expanded into a claim that the army possessed a legitimate collective interest. Its soldiers had fought for the kingdom and refused to be treated as disposable instruments by Westminster. In June AD 1647, Cornet George Joyce took custody of Charles at Holmby House. The precise authorization behind the action remains disputed, but its meaning was unmistakable. Parliament no longer securely controlled either the king or the army raised in its name. Senior officers still sought settlement rather than regicide. The heads of proposals, associated with Henry Ireton and John Lambert, offered regular parliaments, limits on royal control of armed force, and a degree of religious toleration. Charles treated the proposals as another opportunity to play rival factions against one another. At the Putney debates, Leveller-influenced representatives pressed for wider male participation and a more equal distribution of representation. Thomas Rainsborough argued that the poorest man's life possessed the same value to him as the greatest man's life possessed to the great. Ireton replied that political power required a permanent stake in the kingdom, fearing that numerical majorities without property might overturn property itself. The Levellers did not advocate universal suffrage in the modern sense, and the army never became uniformly leveller. Even so, ordinary soldiers were now disputing the foundations of consent before officers who had once expected obedience. Charles escaped to the Isle of Wight and secretly concluded the engagement with Scottish supporters. The Second Civil War followed in AD 1648. Royalist uprisings, the Siege of Colchester, Scottish invasion, and renewed bloodshed after settlement had appeared possible. Around Preston, Cromwell defeated the larger but dispersed Scottish Engager army through concentration, aggression, and relentless pursuit. Among army leaders, suspicion hardened into moral judgment. Charles was increasingly condemned as a man of blood whose promises could not bind him. The army remonstrance demanded justice. When a parliamentary majority still favored negotiation, Colonel Thomas Pride's soldiers excluded or arrested members of the Commons in December AD 1648. The surviving remnant became the Rump Parliament. The army had defeated the king in the field. It now claimed authority to determine which king, which parliament, and which portion of the people possessed political legitimacy. Pride's purge made a royal trial possible while poisoning its representative foundation. Soldiers who claimed to defend parliamentary liberty had physically removed parliamentarians. The remaining barrier was no longer a royalist army or a Scottish invasion, but the ancient contention that the king, as the source of earthly justice, could not himself be judged by his subjects. The purge had cleared the political ground before the trial began. In January AD 1649, the remaining House of Commons created a High Court of Justice after the House of Lords rejected the measure. This was more than a court trying a captive monarch. It was a revolutionary theory of sovereignty placing the ancient theory in chains. The charge named Charles I a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy who had waged war against Parliament and the people. Beneath that accusation stood a radical claim. Kingship was not the private ownership of a realm. It was a public trust. If a ruler turned delegated power against the community from which political authority arose, that community could call him to account. Charles recognized the abyss beneath the argument. He refused to plead and repeatedly demanded to know by what lawful authority he had been brought before the court. The Lords had not approved it. The surviving Commons had been mutilated by military force. No established law had created a tribunal capable of judging the king. Even if Parliament possessed extraordinary judicial authority, Charles argued, one purged chamber could not plausibly embody the whole kingdom. His defense therefore reached beyond a simple appeal to divine right. It exposed the court's foundational contradiction. The judges claimed to represent the people, yet no national electorate had authorized them to execute the monarch. Their proceedings invoked law, yet Colonel Pride's soldiers had determined which lawmakers were permitted to remain in Parliament. The prosecution answered with a principle whose consequences extended far beyond Charles. No public officeholder, not even a hereditary sovereign, could stand beyond responsibility for public bloodshed. Charles rejected the court because accepting its jurisdiction would concede that sovereignty could judge its sovereign. The commissioners continued because retreat would concede that hereditary office could survive any abuse committed in its name. The court convicted him. On January 30th, AD 1649, Charles stepped onto the scaffold outside the banqueting house at Whitehall. He maintained to the end that the liberty of the subject consisted in government and law, not in sharing the exercise of government itself. Then England killed its king. The execution ended Charles's relentless political maneuvering. It did not determine who now possessed legitimate authority. The act abolishing the kingship declared monarchy unnecessary, burdensome, and dangerous. The House of Lords was abolished, and in May, AD 1649, England was declared a commonwealth and free state. But the republic rested upon the Rump Parliament, the remnant created by an army purge. It spoke in the language of popular sovereignty while depending upon soldiers for survival. The removal of arbitrary monarchy had not automatically produced government by consent. It had opened a vacancy at the summit of the state, and the army remained the only institution powerful enough to prevent that vacancy from becoming anarchy. The revolution could not remain confined to England. Ireland and Scotland rejected the settlement imposed at Westminster, though for different political and religious reasons. In Ireland, Confederate Catholic power, English and Anglo-Irish royalism, colonial expansion, land hunger, confessional hatred, and demands for retribution became entangled in a conquest of exceptional brutality. At Drogheda in September, AD 1649, Cromwell's forces stormed the town after its royalist defenders refused to surrender. Most of the garrison was killed, while clergy and civilians also died. At Wexford the following month, negotiations collapsed as parliamentary troops entered the town. The result was killing, plunder, destruction, and the deaths of soldiers and civilians. Parliamentarian leaders defended such severity as military necessity, divine judgment, and retaliation for earlier Protestant suffering. Those explanations reveal the beliefs of the conquerors. They do not erase the consequences for the conquered. Violence was followed by confiscation, dispossession, forced transplantation, and a profound restructuring of Irish landholding. Military victory became colonial transformation, and its trauma endured long after successive governments tried to bury it beneath the language of settlement. Scotland produced another answer to the crisis of sovereignty. The Scots proclaimed Charles II, while demanding his acceptance of the covenanted religious order. Cromwell's victory at Dunbar in September AD 1650 shattered the immediate Scottish position without ending resistance. But supremacy was not stability. The rump moved cautiously on reform and showed little eagerness to dissolve itself. Its defenders regarded caution as protection for property, law, and social order. Its army critics saw self-preservation disguised as constitutional prudence. In April AD 1653, Cromwell entered the chamber and dissolved the parliament whose cause he had once defended in battle. The nominated assembly that followed, later derided as barebones parliament, pursued reform without a durable base of political consent. It surrendered power before the year ended. The instrument of government then established the Protectorate, with Cromwell as Lord Protector. This was a remarkable experiment in written constitutionalism, dividing authority among Protector, Council, and Parliament while providing for regular assemblies and a limited degree of religious toleration. Yet written rules could not conceal the ultimate source of enforcement. The Protectorate depended upon the army, raised revenue under disputed authority, and repeatedly collided with parliaments unwilling to become decorative partners. It possessed administrative energy, reforming ambition, and formidable military power. It never secured the broad, habitual acceptance that transforms a victorious regime into a legitimate political order. When Cromwell died in AD 1658, that weakness became impossible to hide. Richard Cromwell inherited the office but not his father's authority over officers, veterans, and competing factions. Governments appeared and disappeared. The rump returned, was expelled, and returned again. The sword had become the final arbiter of politics, but the sword could not agree with itself. General George Monk marched south from Scotland and reopened the political field. The members excluded by Pride's purge returned, the Long Parliament dissolved itself, and a convention parliament assembled. Through the Declaration of Breda, Charles II offered a broad pardon, settlement of disputed property through Parliament, payment of army arrears, and a degree of religious indulgence. His promises were carefully flexible. After years of military intervention and constitutional improvisation, restoration appeared less dangerous than continued uncertainty. In AD 1660, the monarchy returned amid public celebration. Some regicides were executed, episcopal government was restored, and the republican experiments were officially repudiated. But restoration could not make the preceding 11 years unreal. England had learned that a king could be defeated, tried, and killed. It had also learned that those who destroyed monarchy in the name of liberty could reproduce coercion beneath republican titles. The restored political order inherited a sharpened fear of standing armies, deeper disputes over taxation and consent, and the memory that control of armed force could determine which parliament was allowed to speak. Those anxieties formed part of the political world that produced the Revolution of AD 1688 and the Bill of Rights of AD 1689, which constrained royal authority and reaffirmed important parliamentary protections. But no straight road connected the scaffold at Whitehall to modern democracy. The path ran through conquest, censorship, military government, religious exclusion, restoration, and another revolution. The civil wars did not deliver a finished constitutional settlement. They exposed problems that later generations would be forced to confront again. The deepest transformation was not the permanent triumph of king, parliament, or army. None achieved that victory. It was the destruction of the assumption that inherited mystique alone could make political authority secure. Yet proving that principle carried a catastrophic price. Dead soldiers and civilians, shattered communities, the conquest and dispossession of Ireland, military intervention in parliament, regicide, and years of unstable government. Distrust had not been imaginary. Charles concealed intentions and conducted negotiations that destroyed confidence in his word. Parliament stretched emergency authority until constitutional defense became constitutional innovation. The army possessed genuine grievances, then used coercion to decide which representatives counted as the nation. Each violation supplied the next faction with evidence that only greater power could guarantee survival. Victory answers who possesses force. Legitimacy answers why obedience should continue after force leaves the room. Institutions collapse when political opponents cease to regard one another as legitimate participants and begin to interpret every concession as an existential surrender. The tragedy of the English Civil Wars was not that fear lacked evidence. The evidence was abundant. The tragedy was that every authentic betrayal made the next escalation appear necessary, until Crown, Parliament, and Army all claimed that extraordinary power was the only defense against destruction. The unresolved question is therefore not whether Charles deserved confidence, or whether Parliament and the Army possessed legitimate grievances. It is whether political trust can be rebuilt after every faction has acquired rational reasons for suspicion, and what authority can enforce restraint when the institutions meant to provide that authority have become parties to the struggle. For another investigation into the moment political power escaped its constitutional restraints, select the documentary on the end screen. Which institution bears the greatest responsibility for the final collapse? The Crown, Parliament, or the Army? Leave the verdict in the comments, and subscribe to Archives of Humanity for historically rigorous examinations of how states gain power, lose legitimacy, and confront the consequences.